Barron Trump was so polite in his request that no one took him seriously, but all eyes froze on him the moment Melania walked into the room. Morning sun streamed through the tall glass windows of Pinecrest Financial Bank in downtown San Diego. It was the kind of place where every surface gleamed and the air was thick with the hum of efficiency. Sharp dressers occupied the various teller stations. Clipped conversations and professionalism dominated the air, and clients streamed in and out of the institution with a purpose. At 10, the heavy oak doors swung open and a young man, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit with crisp white shirt, stepped inside. His polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floor as he walked with quiet confidence toward the front counter. His hair was neatly styled, his posture straight, and his presence commanded attention, though not in the way one might expect. Barron Trump, now a young adult, approached the counter with a slight smile. He had a composed air of assurance that only those accustomed to the public eye, yet having no great need to be boastful, possess. Coming up to the counter, he scanned the teller's nameplate. "Sandra, good morning," he started on civil terms, his voice calm and courteous. "I'd like to open a new account, please." Sandra barely glanced up, giving him the once-over with an expression that landed somewhere between disinterest and skepticism. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her tone clipped. "I don't," Barron admitted, his smile unchanging, "but I was told I could speak to someone about opening an account." Sandra sighed audibly, tapping her pen against the counter. Her eyes lingered on him, and for a moment, it seemed like she was calculating whether he was worth her time. Behind her, two other employees exchanged knowing glances, one of them muttering something under his breath that made the other stifle a laugh. Barron remained unfazed, though he was clearly aware of the atmosphere shifting around him. "Is there someone available who can assist me?" he asked calmly. Sandra finally met his gaze, but for the first time, her eyes conveyed something more akin to a sneer than not. "We're actually pretty slammed today," she flatly said. "Maybe get an appointment on the book sometime. We are not a walk-in clinic after all." Barron blinked in response, furrowing the lower edges of his mouth just infinitesimally. He felt into the pocket of his tailored suit jacket for a smooth black leather portfolio. "I have all the necessary documents right here," he explained, his voice still polite but with a hint of firmness. "It should only take a few minutes." Sandra barely glanced at the portfolio before letting out a sharp breath. "Look," she said, her voice lowered slightly, "this isn't exactly the sort of place you just walk into and immediately get waited on. We service a specific type of clientele." There it was, the implied assumption, wrapped in a veneer of professionalism but dripping with judgment. Barron didn't flinch. "I understand," he said, his voice measured, "but I believe this is exactly the kind of place I'm looking for." Still, Sandra wasn't budging. She gestured vaguely toward the exit. "I think you might be more comfortable at a different branch, maybe somewhere more accommodating." But what happened next would ensure that everyone in that room would remember this day for a long time. The air in the bank seemed to grow heavier as Sandra's dismissive tone echoed across the quiet lobby. Barron stood there for a moment, his calm demeanor unwavering. His eyes flicked to the other staff members behind the counter, who were now openly whispering and smirking, clearly enjoying the unfolding scene. One of them, a younger man with a name tag reading Kyle M., leaned forward and whispered something under his breath. Whatever it was made her lips twitch into a smug smile. Sandra turned back to Barron and tilted her head as if sizing him up once more. "Listen," she said, her voice adopting a patronizing lilt, "this isn't the kind of place where we deal with casual walk-ins. Maybe you didn't read the sign properly on your way in?" Barron's brows furrowed slightly. "I'm sorry, did I miss something?" he asked, his voice still calm but with a slight edge of incredulity. Kyle, who had been eavesdropping, suddenly chimed in. "Yeah, buddy," he said loudly enough for others to hear, "this isn't one of those banks where you just show up and think you'll be handed a free checking account. You need to, meet certain qualifications." Barron's eyes flicked to Kyle, his face expressionless but his body posture slightly more tense. "I see," he said, his voice even. "And what qualifications are those?" Kyle shrugged, shifting back in his chair with a smug grin. "Let's just say the kind of people we usually deal with don't walk in without an appointment." Sandra chuckled softly, apparently bolstered by her colleague's words. "Exactly. We have a certain standard here," she added. "It's nothing personal, of course." Barron took a deep breath, scanning the lobby around him. The other clients now watched the scene secretly, their interest piqued. Some of them exchanged awkward glances, but none intervened. Barron turned back to Sandra, his jaw visibly tensing in the slightest. "I appreciate that you're busy," he said, steady but firm. "I just don't believe my request unreasonable." If someone else, I might be able to discuss this with perhaps a manager. I will happily wait. For a second Sandra's smile wilted. She recovered her aplomb quickly though. Our manager is out today, she said with a quick smile, and honestly, we don't have time to explain our policies to every walk-in who comes through the door. Kyle laughed again, and this time Barron's eyes flashed with something that looked like disappointment rather than anger. He slowly closed his portfolio and slid it back into his jacket. For a moment, the room seems to catch its breath as he stands there staring at Sandra and Kyle as if memorizing their faces. Thanks for your time, he said finally, voice low but pointed. He did not say a word and simply turned around, walking towards the exit. Just as glass doors were about to close behind him, however, the bank's atmosphere shifted in a way no one could have predicted. The glass doors hadn't even swung shut behind Barron when a sleek black SUV pulled up just outside the bank. It was understated yet undeniably expensive. The vehicle drew a few curious glances from passers-by. Staring from the passenger side is Melania Trump, who exited the vehicle with such an effortlessness as to command attention immediately. Wearing a tailored cream coat and dark sunglasses, she walked with quiet authority. Her heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she walked towards the entrance, her posture regal and her face calm but resolute. Those nearby the windows straightened instinctively, their eyes widening at recognition. Inside, Sandra was already describing the exchange with Barron to Kyle, laughing softly as she mimicked his tone of polite inquiry. Can you believe he actually thought? But her words went unspoken when the doors swung open again, and Melania strode into the lobby. The room became silent, conversations trailed off in mid-sentence, and the gentle hum of typing on keyboards went silent. Heads swiveled in tandem as Melania reached for her sunglasses and scanned the room. Her gaze was direct, unwavering as she spotted Barron standing just beyond the counter, his back to her. Barron, she called, her voice clear and composed, cutting through the stunned quiet. He turned, his expression softening slightly as he saw his mother approach. Mom, he greeted her, his tone measured but carrying a hint of relief. Melania reached his side in a few fluid strides, placing a reassuring hand on his arm before turning her attention to the counter. Her piercing gaze landed on Sandra, who was now visibly flustered, her earlier confidence crumbling under Melania's scrutiny. Is there a problem here? Melania asked, her voice calm but firm. The question wasn't directed at Barron, it was clearly meant for Sandra. Sandra stuttered, cheeks reddening as she stammered for an answer. No ma'am, she finally replied, speaking barely above a whisper. Kyle, who was seated behind the counter, seemed equally pained. He squirmed in his chair, avoiding Melania's gaze as he fumbled over the pile of papers amidst the counter. Melania didn't say anything loudly, but the weight of her presence proved palpable. I was under the impression that this bank prides itself on professionalism, she said, her words deliberate. But from what I've seen, that standard was not extended to my son. Sandra opened her mouth to respond but quickly closed it again, clearly unsure of what to say. The other staff members watched in stunned silence, their earlier smugness now replaced with a mix of embarrassment and fear. Melania took a step closer to the counter, her expression unreadable. Perhaps you did not know him, she continued, her tone much more sharp now. But that is no excuse for treating anyone, especially a prospective client, with such disrespect. Sandra's swallow was hard to hide. Her hands shook slightly as she tried to regain her composure. I didn't know, she began with her voice trailing off. No, Melania interrupted, her voice slicing through the air like a knife. You didn't even bother to realize, and that is the problem. But what happened next would make sure Sandra and Kyle would never forget this meeting or its outcome. The silence in the bank was deafening. Sandra's face had turned a deep shade of red, her earlier smugness replaced with visible discomfort. Kyle, who had ridiculed Barron with such speed and ease only moments before, now seemed as if he wished to sink beneath his chair in a way. The other employees, who had whispered and snickered earlier, stood frozen in their stations, their eyes jumping nervously from Melania to the other employees. Melania held them, her expression unyielding. You are an example of this establishment, she said, her words precise and piercing. Your behavior reflects not only on yourselves but on the bank as a whole. If you cannot offer basic courtesy and professionalism, perhaps you are in the wrong line of work. Sandra opened her mouth, but no words came out. Kyle shifted awkwardly, glancing around for backup, but none of the other staff dared to intervene. Tension filled the air, and seconds of silence passed like an eternity. I wish to speak to the manager, Melania said again, her tone calm but arguing for no comeback. Now. Sandra blinked, her fingers fidgeting with the mouse in front of her. "Ma'am, the manager is not," she began before Melania's stare cut her off. "Then go find them," Melania said coldly. "I will not leave until this is resolved." Reluctantly, Sandra nodded and scurried off toward a door marked management. The other staff watched her go, their faces a mix of embarrassment and dread. Kyle, meanwhile, busied himself pretending to sort paperwork, though his shaking hands betrayed his nerves. While they waited, Melania turned to Barron. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her demeanor changing in an instant from commanding to maternal. Barron nodded, offering her a small smile. "I'm fine," he replied, "but thank you for coming." Melania gave his arm a reassuring squeeze before turning her attention back to the counter. The other clients in the lobby, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, began whispering among themselves. Some appeared sympathetic, others intrigued, but all seemed mesmerized by the quiet drama playing out before them. Minutes later, Sandra returned, trailing behind a middle-aged man in a gray suit who looked flustered but determined to smooth things over. His name tag identified him as Michael L., branch manager. "Mrs. Trump," he began, holding out a hand Melania didn't take, "I truly apologize for the inconvenience. Let's just go into my office and talk about this." Melania didn't budge. "What there is to be discussed is the behavior of your staff," she said sternly. "My son came here to open an account and was treated to ridicule and disrespect. Tell me, is this the way you train your staff to treat prospects?" Michael paled. "Of course not," he stammered. "This is utterly unacceptable. I assure you will take immediate action." Melania raised an eyebrow. "Immediate action?" she repeated, her tone skeptical. "I hope that means more than just a lot of promises." Michael nodded hastily. "Absolutely. I'll take care of this myself. Please let me fix this." Melania looked at him for a long time before nodding finally. "Good. Because if I ever hear about this again, I will make sure everyone who was involved will be accountable to me, and to you." Michael gulped, nodding again. "Okay." As the argument ended, the faces of the staff members were lined with shame and regret. They had underrated Barron, judged him according to their own perception, and were now paying the price for their deeds. But this was not yet the end. Melania had a final message for the bank. The room was still tense as Melania turned back to Sandra and Kyle, now visibly shaken. Their earlier bravado had all disappeared, and they now realized that their actions were not only unprofessional but had the potential to cost them their jobs. Melania took a deliberate step closer to the counter. Her voice steady but firm. "Respect is not something you offer selectively because of appearances or assumptions," she said, looking out at the whole room. "It is a reflection of your character, not the status of the person standing in front of you." Sandra's hands trembled against the edge of the counter while Kyle looked down at his desk and avoided making eye contact with her. Melania was magnetic in presence, but it was only amplified by words filled with the weight of experience and authority. The clients sat in silence observing everything, then nodding along as if now silent agreement settled within them and a mix of admiration and approval filled their expression. "You never know who stands before you," Melania went on, growing softer but still full of impact. "Whether my son or somebody with no famous last name, everyone deserves dignity." Barron, quietly standing there with her, peeked out from the corner of his eyes. He'd gotten used to being scrutinized and assumed due to his famous family name. Yet, hearing his mother defend him as she does this moment was an instant flashback of the qualities his mother has instilled into him. Respect, grace, and standing for what is right. Michael, the branch manager, stepped up with a gleam in his eyes to dispel the remaining tension. "Mrs. Please let us rectify this," he said with all sincerity. "We will see that this doesn't happen again, and Mr. Trump, we would be privileged to be of service in opening your account today." Melania looked at him sternly, only her eyes seemed to smile. "See that you do," she replied. She then turned to Barron. "Do you want to go ahead?" Barron paused, his gaze flickering momentarily to Sandra and then to Kyle. They seemed completely vanquished, their confidence now nothing but a memory. He turned back to his mother, the right corner of his mouth creasing into a small smile. "Yes," he stated simply. As Michael personally ushered him into his office, Melania addressed the staff one final time. "Let this be a lesson, people," she announced strongly. "Don't ever let your assumptions cloud your judgment about anyone again. You would not make the same mistake twice." She followed Barron out of the office and Sandra and Kyle stood there in stunned silence. The other employees exchanged uneasy glances and began whispering among themselves. The entire bank took a collective breath and finally the tension subsided. But even as the manager's door closed, the weight of that lesson hung heavy in the air, reminding everyone that respect and humility are never optional. Inside the manager's office, it was quiet but full of unspoken thoughts. Barron sat across from Michael, who went through all the paperwork piece by piece. His hands were still shaking slightly. Melania stood off to one side, unwavering calmness written on her face as she watched. Despite the earlier tension, now her presence seemed less an argument and more an incursion teaching point. As Michael passed Barron the pen to sign the final document, he hesitated for a moment, then looked up at the manager. "I think this serves as a learning curve for all of us," he said calmly but deliberately. "The way you treat people reflects far more about you than it says about them." Michael nodded seriously. "You're right," he admitted. "And I'm truly sorry the way you were treated today. It won't happen again." Barron finished signing the paperwork, then stood and extended a hand. Michael took it, his grip firm, though he could hardly hide that he felt the weight of the moment. Melania offered a small nod of approval before leaving with her son. As they exited the office, the lobby seemed to have changed. The once dismissive staff now avoided eye contact, their postures tense with embarrassment. The other clients who'd witnessed the entire ordeal gave discreet nods and encouragement as Barron and Melania walked towards the exit. Just before stepping out, Melania stopped. She looked around at the room, her gaze seeming to penetrate every soul. Today wasn't about an account, it was about integrity. Remember the next time someone walks through those doors. Without waiting for an answer, she turned and walked out with Barron by her side. The glass doors closed behind them, leaving a bank full of staff and clients to ponder what they had just seen. Outside, the black SUV waited, its driver stepping out to open the door for them. As Barron climbed in, he turned to his mother. "You didn't have to do all that," he said with a small smile, though his tone held a note of thanks. Melania smiled softly, putting a hand on his shoulder. "It's not just about you," she said. "It's about teaching people to do better for themselves and for others." The SUV pulled away, leaving the bank and its staff behind, but the impact of the encounter lingered long after they were gone. For Sandra and Kyle, it was a stark reminder of the dangers of prejudice and the importance of treating every individual with respect, regardless of their appearance or assumptions about their worth. This story isn't just about Barron or Melania, it's about all of us. It's a reminder that our actions and words matter, especially when dealing with others. Judging someone based on appearances or preconceived notions not only hurts them but reveals our own shortcomings. The lesson here is simple. Treat everyone with dignity because you never know the story behind the face standing in front of you. If you believe in standing up for respect and fairness, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire change and understanding. Let's make kindness the standard, not the exception.